The Fall of Orthodox England, The Spiritual Roots of the Norman Conquest, 1043–1087, by Vladimir Moss. Foreword. On October 14, 1066, at Hastings in southern England, the last Orthodox King of England, Harold II, died in battle against Duke William of Normandy. William had been blessed to invade England by the Roman Pope Alexander in order to bring the English Church into full communion with the Reformed papacy. For since 1052, the English Archbishop had been banned and denounced as schismatic by Rome. The result of the Norman conquest was that the English Church and people were integrated into the heretical Church of Western, Papist Christendom, which had just in 1054 fallen away from communion with the one, holy, Catholic and Apostolic Church, represented by the Eastern Patriarchates of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch and Jerusalem. Thus ended the nearly 500-year history of the Anglo-Saxon Orthodox Church, which was followed by the demise of the still older Celtic Orthodox churches in Wales, Scotland and Ireland. This small book is an account of how this came to pass. It is neither the aim of the present writer, nor would it be within his competence, to give a detailed political, military, or social history of the period. With regard to most of the major issues disputed by historians, he has simply adopted, without detailed argument, what seems to him to be the most plausible version of events. Thus, with regard to King Edward's alleged bequest of his kingdom to William of Normandy, he has adopted the position taken by Ian Walker, while with regard to the Pope's involvement in the invasion, he has followed David Douglas, Frank Barlow, David Howarth, and Frank MacLean. The main aim of the present work is twofold. First, to provide a spiritual, as opposed to a political or social history of the decline and fall of Orthodox England, and secondly, to collect material relevant to the hoped-for future glorification of the great spiritual heroes of the period, notably King Edward the Confessor and Martyr King Harold, in the Orthodox Church. The writer feels that such an undertaking is especially timely now, that the relics of Martyr King Harold have been discovered and identified through the invaluable research carried out by John Pollock. It is this spiritual and hagiographical nature of the present work that explains why the writer has made much more extensive use of the hagiographical materials available than most modern researchers into the period, with their bias against anything that smacks of the miraculous. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us. Amen. Introduction. England and the Continent. The beginning of the end. The ancient Celtic churches of the British Isles had never had much to do with Rome, not out of antipathy, but because of distance and especially a long period in the 5th and 6th centuries during which the Celts had been cut off from the Church on the continent by the pagan invasions. In any case, Celtic Christianity owed as much to Eastern, especially Coptic Christianity, as it did to Rome. By contrast, after the English were converted to Orthodoxy in the 7th century, they became perhaps the most fervent Romanists of all the peoples of Western Europe. This devotion sprang from the fact that it was to Rome, and specifically to Pope St. Gregory the Great and his disciples, that the Angles, Saxons and Jutes of southern England owed their conversion to the faith in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. From that time, English men and women of all classes and conditions poured across the Channel in a well-beaten path to the tombs of the Apostles in Rome, and a whole quarter of the city was called Il Borgo Saxono because of the large number of English pilgrims it accommodated. English missionaries such as St. Boniface of Germany carried out their work as the legates of the Roman popes, and the voluntary tax known as Peter's Pence, which the English offered to the Roman See, was paid even in the difficult times of the Viking invasions, when it was the English themselves who were in need of alms. However, the Romanity to which the English were so devoted was not the Franco-Latin Roman Catholicism of the later Middle Ages. Rather, it was the Greco-Roman Romanitas or Romeocene of Orthodox Catholicism, and the spiritual and political capital of Romanitas until the middle of the 15th century was not Old Rome in Italy, but the New Rome of Constantinople. Thus, when King Ethelbert of Kent was baptized by St. Augustine in 597, he had entered, as Fonter Andrew Phillips writes, Romanitas, Romanity, the universe of Roman Christendom, becoming one of those numerous kings who owed allegiance, albeit formal, to the emperor in New Rome. Indeed, as late as the 10th century, the cultural links between England and Constantinople remained strong. We may tentatively point to the murder of King Edward the Martyr in 979 as the beginning of the end of Orthodox England. No worse deed for the English was ever done than this, said the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And while it was said that there was great rejoicing at the coronation of St. Edward's half-brother, Ethelred the Unready, St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, sorrowfully prophesied great woes for the nation in the coming reign, he was right. For not only were the English defeated by the Danish pagan invaders and forced to pay ever larger sums in Danegeld, but the king himself, betrayed by his leading men and weighed down by his own personal failures, was forced to flee abroad in 1013. The next year he was recalled by the English leaders, both spiritual and lay, who declared that no lord was dearer to them than their rightful lord, if only he would govern his kingdom more justly than he had done in the past. But the revival was illusory. Further defeats followed, and in 1017, after the deaths both of King Ethelred and of his son Edmund Ironside, the Danish Canute was made king of all the English. Canute converted to the faith of his new Christian subjects, and the period of the Danish kings, 1017–1042, created less of a disruption in the nation's spiritual life than might have been expected. Nevertheless, it must have seemed that God's mercy had at last returned to his people when, in 1043, the Old English dynasty of Alfred the Great was restored in the person of King Ethelred's son Edward, known to later generations as the Confessor. It is with the life of King Edward that our narrative begins. However, in order to understand the world of King Edward, it is necessary briefly to review cultural and ecclesiastical developments on the continent of Europe, which began to influence England precisely in his reign. These included the rise of the heretical papacy and the growth of feudalism. The rise of the heretical papacy. As the power of the Holy Roman Emperors of the West declined in the 9th century, so the power of the popes increased. Beginning with Nicholas I, they began to claim a quasi-imperial rule over the whole Church, East and West. And this imperial role began increasingly to resemble the Imperator plus Pontifex Maximus role of the pagan Roman emperors. The heresy of papism was born. However, for the first 8 centuries, every attempt to combine the roles of king and priest in a single person was decisively rejected by the popes. Thus when, in 796, Eadbert Prien, an English priest, assumed the crown of the sub-kingdom of Kent for himself, he was immediately rejected by the Archbishop of Canterbury and anathematized by Pope Leo III, who wrote that such a priest-king was like Julian the Apostate. But gradually, and with increasing self-assertion, the popes themselves claimed a kingly power and role. One of the reasons for this was that after the Western Empire had collapsed after 476 and split up into a number of independent kingdoms, the Church remained united, making her by far the most prominent survival of Christian Romanity in the West. Even the most powerful of the Western kings did not command a territory greater than that of a Roman provincial governor, whereas the Pope was not only the undisputed leader of the whole of Western Christendom, but also the senior hierarch in the whole of the Church, Eastern and Western. However, as long as the popes remained both orthodox in faith and loyal subjects of the Eastern Emperor in politics, that is, until Pope Stephen's political break with Byzantium in 756, the lack of a political power in the West, commensurate with the ecclesiastical power of the popes, was not a pressing necessity. For everyone accepted that in the political sphere the Eastern Emperor was the sole basileus of the whole of Christendom, and the Western kings were his sons or satraps, while in the ecclesiastical sphere there was no single head under Christ, the body being overseen by its 5 senses, the 5 patriarchates, of which Rome was simply the primus inter pares. But problems arose when Rome broke its last political links with the Eastern Empire and sought a new protector in the Frankish Empire of Pepin and Charlemagne. This caused changes in the political ideology of the Franks, on the one hand, who came to see themselves as the real Roman Empire, more Roman and more orthodox than the Empire of the East, and on the other hand, in the ecclesiology of the popes, who came to see themselves as the only church of this renewed Roman Empire, having ultimate jurisdiction over all the churches in the world. Frankish Caesaropapism soon collapsed, but Roman Papo-Caesarism continued to grow until it claimed supreme authority in both church and state. In fact, there is a strong argument to be made for the thesis that the ultimate gainer from Charlemagne's coronation in 800 was not the new emperor, but the Pope. Judith Herrin writes, "Of the 3 powers involved in the coronation event of 800, the Roman pontiff emerges as the clear winner in the triangular contest over imperial authority. By seizing the initiative and crowning Charles in his own way, Pope Leo claimed the superior authority to anoint an imperial ruler of the West, which established an important precedent. Later, Charles would insist on crowning his own son Louis as emperor without papal intervention. He thus designated his successor, and in due course Louis inherited his father's authority. But the notion that a Western ruler could not be a real emperor without a papal coronation and acclamation in ancient Rome grew out of the ceremonial devised by Leo III in 800. So the foundations were laid for the growth of papal power in the political as well as the ecclesiastical spheres, which growth was especially evident as Carolingian power declined later in the 9th century. The significant figure here is Pope Nicholas I, whose first task was to establish his supremacy over the Church in the West. However, an orthodox ecclesiology still prevailed at the metropolitan and lower levels. Thus, the archbishops of Treves and Cologne replied to an unjust sentence by Nicholas as follows: "Without a council, without canonical inquiry, without accuser, without witnesses, without convicting us by arguments or authorities, without our consent, in the absence of the metropolitans and of our suffragan bishops, you have chosen to condemn us, of your own caprice, with tyrannical fury. But we do not accept your accursed sentence, so repugnant to a father's or a brother's love. We despise it as mere insulting language. We expel you yourself from our communion, since you commune with the excommunicate. We are satisfied with the communion of the whole Church, and with the society of our brethren, whom you despise, and of whom you make yourself unworthy by your pride and arrogance. You condemn yourself when you condemn those who do not observe the apostolic precepts, which you yourself are the first to violate, annulling as far as in you lies the divine laws and the sacred canons, and not following in the footsteps of the popes your predecessors." 18. Nicholas did not confine himself to unjustly deposing Western bishops. He also deposed St. Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, whose speedy promotion to the rank of Patriarch from the lay state he considered uncanonical. Although many holy patriarchs, and the famous St. Ambrose of Milan, had risen to the episcopate as quickly. All this was in accordance with his theory, first put forward in 865, that the Pope had authority over all the earth, that is, over every other church. The See of Peter has received the total power of government over all the sheep of Christ. The Emperor Michael III was furious, but Nicholas replied, "The day of king priests and emperor pontiffs is past. Christianity has separated the two functions, and Christian emperors have need of the Pope in view of the life eternal, whereas popes have no need of emperors except as regards temporal things." This would suggest that Nicholas supported the Orthodox teaching on the separation of the secular and ecclesiastical powers. However, while it was useful for him to preach the Orthodox doctrine in order to limit the power of the emperor, he accepted few, if any, limitations on his own power. He even hinted that the Byzantine emperors might not be legitimate emperors of the Romans, which would imply that the only legitimate emperor was the Frankish one. Or, if the forged donation of Constantine was to be believed, the Pope himself. Thus he said that it was ridiculous for Michael to call himself Roman Emperor, since he did not speak Latin. Then he demanded from the emperor the return of his territories in the Greek-speaking south of Italy, for no other reason than that they had once, centuries before, come within the jurisdiction of the Roman Patriarchate. "Give us back the patrimony of Calabria and that of Sicily, and all the property of our church, whereof it held possession, and which it was accustomed to manage by its own attorneys. For it is unreasonable that an ecclesiastical possession, destined for the light and service of the Church of God, should be taken from us by an earthly power." Finally, he sent missionaries to Bulgaria, which was deep within the traditionally Byzantine sphere. To add injury to insult, these missionaries preached the heresy of the Filioque to the newly converted Bulgarians. For this reason, a council convened at Constantinople in 867, presided over by Saint Photius, and at which the archbishops of Trèves, Cologne, and Ravenna were present, excommunicated and anathematized Nicholas. 2 years later, however, a palace revolution enabled another anti-Photian council to be convened, at which the Council of 867 was annulled. Papists have often counted this anti-Photian council as the Eighth Ecumenical, not least, one suspects, because the new Pope, Hadrian II, demanded that all its participants recognized him as sovereign pontiff and universal pope. But a much better claim to ecumenicity can be made for the Great Council convened at Constantinople in 879–80, which 400 Eastern bishops and the legates of Pope John VIII attended. This council annulled, under the papal legate's signature, the acts of the Anti-Photian Council. It also made two very important decisions. First, it decreed that there was no papal jurisdiction in the East, although the papal primacy was recognized. And secondly, it reaffirmed the original text of the Nicene Creed without the Filioque, and explicitly condemned all additions to it. So a Roman Pope formally recognized that he had no jurisdiction in the Eastern Church, and that the Filioque was a heresy, the growth of feudalism. Thus was the Papist heresy crushed, for the time being. However, the serpent of papism lay bruised, not completely scotched, and a more permanent triumph could be hoped for only if a healthy antidote against its poison could be built up within the West. This depended above all on the strength of the other pillar of Christian society in the West, the sacred power of the anointed kings. Such an antidote existed, as we shall see, in England, where a powerful monarchy ruling most of the country arose in the person of King Alfred the Great. On most of the continent, however, the monarchy was deeply involved in a phenomenon that had a profoundly negative impact on both political and ecclesiastical life: feudalism. The word feudalism comes from the Latin feuda, translated as fief, which means a peace land held in exchange for service to a lord. Feudalism, in the sense of the widespread division of the land into fiefs, is a common phenomenon in many lands in time of invasion or social decline. But the term was invented to describe the particular socio-political organization of Western Europe in the later Middle Ages. It arose as a defensive reaction to the Viking invasions of the 9th century, and the breakdown in central authority which they caused. The breakdown was worst in West Francia, modern France, where royal authority almost disappeared. One result was serfdom. The lands which had belonged to the crown, the royal fisc, were given to local landowners, both ecclesiastical and lay, and the peasants who had cultivated the land, deprived of any protection from the crown, threw themselves on the mercy of the local landowners, bartering their and their children's labour in return for protection. The second was feudalism proper. The freemen became vassals of lords, swearing to fight the lords' battles in exchange for protection. A vassal was a knight. That is, he owned arms and a horse and was able to fight. Since this required money, he very likely owned land, either inherited, allodial land, or a benefice or fief, granted temporarily in the vassal's lifetime only. A vassal might himself have vassals. Thus, many of the king's counts, or local officials, were at the same time both feudal lords and vassals of the king. Feudalism ate into the king's power in two ways. First, the king's peasants hardly counted as his subjects any more, since their real masters were now their landowners. And secondly, the king's vassals tended to leave his service for that of the most powerful local feudal lord. The king did not always resist this process, but rather reinforced it, since he saw that the feudal lord was the only guarantee of law and order in the countryside. Thus, in the Capitulary of Meersen in 847, King Charles the Bald ordered all free men to choose a lord, and likewise forbade them to leave their lord without just reason, which effectively made the bond of vassalage permanent in all normal cases. Again, in a capitulary issued at Thionville, he gave official recognition to the vassal's oath, which thereby replaced the oath of allegiance as the main glue-holding society together. Finally, in the Capitulary of Quercy in 877, Charles sanctioned hereditary succession to counties and other fiefs, which meant that county administration became hereditary and passed out of the king's control. As a defensive system to preserve a minimum of order in a time of foreign invasion, feudalism undoubtedly had merits, but it was evidently much inferior not only to Byzantine-style autocracy, but also to the Carolingian system that preceded it. Moreover, as the threat of invasion passed and feudalism spread from its homeland in northern France throughout Western Europe in the 11th century, its degrading and coarsening effect on general morality and its potential, in certain circumstances, for a more than local despotism became more obvious. As Maurice Keene writes, in effect, as a result of the confusion of the 9th and 10th centuries, government had ceased to have much to do with even a rudimentary state machine. It had become part of the patrimony of powerful men. What bound this society together was not a sense of obligation to a common weal, but the personal oaths of individual men to individual lords. The peace of society depended on how far these individuals were prepared to observe their promises, and here, force was a moving factor. The system had grown out of the exigencies of a military situation and bore plenty of marks of its origin. The true centre of a lord's authority was his castle, behind whose walls or palisades he could defy all comers, where, too, he held his court and judged his subjects. The most essential obligation of the vassal was his service in war. His estate was valued by the number of soldiers it could maintain. And if a man was injured in his right by a rival, or if his lord or his underling broke the sworn agreement between them, what king and count and vassal alike fell back on was the ancient right of the free man, the vendetta. He defied his rival in solemn language, and he made war upon him. The wars of feudal noblemen left little peace in many parts of Europe over the 4 centuries following the year 1000. According to Ivan Solonovich, feudalism could be defined as the splintering of state sovereignty among a mass of small, but in principle sovereign owners of property. Contrary to Marx, it had nothing to do with productive relations, and was far from being an advance on previous forms of social organization. It is sufficient to remember the huge cultural and unusually high level of Roman production. Feudal Europe, poor, dirty, and illiterate, by no means represented a more progressive form of productive relations. In spite of Hegel, it was sheer regression. Feudalism does not originate in productive relations. It originates in the thirst for power beyond all dependence on production and distribution. Feudalism is, so to speak, the democratization of power, its transfer to all those who at the given moment in the given place have sufficient physical strength to defend their baronial rights, Faustrecht. Feudalism sometimes presupposes a juridical basis of power, but never a moral one. The feudal lord does not rule in the name of the nation, the people, the peasants, or whoever else there might be. He rules only and exclusively in his own interests, which have been strengthened by such and such battles or parchments. For the feudal lord, the monarch is not the bearer of definite moral ideals, or even of the practical interests of the people or nation, but only the first among equals, who has had the luck to be stronger than the rest. The thirst for power is, of course, a property common to all humanity, and therefore the tendency to the development of feudalism will be to a greater or lesser degree characteristic of all countries and all peoples of the world. But if we discard trivialities, then we must say that Rome, for example, had no knowledge at all of feudal relations. There were landowners and there were senators, there were proconsuls and there were emperors, but there were no barons. The sovereign power of the people and Senate of Rome, engraved on the Roman eagles, remained the single indivisible source of all power, even the power of the Roman emperors. The civil wars of Rome bore no relation to the feudal wars of medieval Europe, nor did ancient Greece with its purely capitalist relations know feudalism. Yes, Greece was split up into a series of sovereign states, but, though tiny, these were nevertheless states, monarchies and republics, in principle having equal rights in relation to each other, and by no means in relations of feudal submission or co-submission. One of the worst aspects of feudalism was the fact that the church too was bound up in the feudal nexus, with churchmen having lay lords higher than themselves and vassals lower than themselves, which resulted, as Aristides Papadakis writes, in the unrestrained secularization of the Western clergy. By the 900s, most churchmen, both high and low, had lost nearly all their independence and sense of corporate identity, as their functions everywhere became identified with those belonging to lay vassals. Quite simply, as rulers came to regard all ecclesiastical organization under their effective control as a facet of the secular system, conventions governing one sphere were adjusted to fit the other. As a result, bishops and abbots were not exempt from the secular obligations and responsibilities attached to feudal tenure. As feudal dependents, they too had to attend court, give advice and, when required, supply their lay superiors with military service. Characteristically, promotion to an episcopal see or a rich abbey was often the reward of previous dutiful service in the royal household. It is worth adding that ecclesiastical tenants were also preferred for many posts because their lands and their jurisdictions were not governed by inheritance. Celibate priests had no legal children, whereas the heirs of a lay vassal holding of the king by hereditary right could occasionally create legal difficulties or foment rebellion. An heirless but enfeoffed celibate cleric was incapable of doing so. This was probably a decisive reason why so many high ecclesiastics, time and again, became essential associates in royal government everywhere. The control exercised by feudal lords over clerical appointments was symbolized by the ceremony of lay investiture, whereby the lord endowed the cleric with a ring, signifying the cleric's entry into feudal tenure of a church or lands. Such a ceremony was distinct from ecclesiastical ordination, but in practice the power inherent in lay investiture determined who should be ordained and for how much. The hastily ordained and invested clerk was often altogether unworthy, if not also incompetent and untrained, of the priestly calling. Church assemblies and individual churchmen, it is true, routinely complained. All the same, neither the power of laymen to appoint and invest clergy nor the encroachment and spoliation of church property was ever discontinued. As a matter of fact, lay nominations to vacant sees became so frequent that they were no longer regarded as a radical departure from canonical tradition. The abuse was recognized as a perfectly acceptable practice. In 921, the Archbishop of Cologne was thus solemnly admonished by the Pope himself for attempting to block a royal appointment at Liège. Pope John X's letter informing the Archbishop that no episcopal candidate was to be consecrated in any diocese without royal authorization still survives. As far as Pope John was concerned, the right of the feudal power to interfere at the highest level in the internal affairs of the Church was ancient usage. Ecclesial autonomy, to say nothing of ecclesial political and economic freedom, was apparently of little consequence. Canon law evidently had long given way to the feudal system. The development of feudalism was aided by the German land law system. One of its results, continues Papadakis, was the so-called Eigenkirchentum, or proprietary church system, an arrangement by which the parish with all its appurtenances became the private property of its founder. In terms of ecclesiastical power, according to one investigator, the main result of this Germanization or privatization was complete revolution. Its overall effect on Latin ecclesiastical organization, at any rate, was profound as well as extensive. This becomes evident when traditional canon law is compared or contrasted with German land law. Plainly put, unlike the Church, early barbarian Europe did not understand the legal concept of corporate ecclesiastical ownership. The idea of an abiding corporation with legal rights simply did not exist in German customary law. Thus, the conviction that the Church could also simultaneously own land or real property as a corporate personality or institution was unknown. Rather, according to Germanic law, everything built on a plot of land, whether it was the local parish church or the monastery, was considered the exclusive property of the landlord. The man who had built and endowed it was also its real owner. Control and rights of ownership of the foundation, constructed on an estate, quite simply, continued to be in the hands of the proprietor. To be sure, the Church could never actually be secularized. On the other hand, it could always be given, sold, traded, or exchanged if necessary. It was even possible to dispose of it as a sort of fief by leasing it to one's relatives or liegemen. In sum, the treatment of parishes was identical to the holding of ordinary pieces of real property. It is worth adding that the resident priest of the Eigenkirche, usually an ill-trained serf from the lord's own estate, was in practice appointed and dismissed by the proprietor. His status resembled a small quasi-feudal dependent. Almost invariably, if the incumbent was married or living in concubinage, he was able to pass the parish on to his son or heir. The practice of buying and selling rural parishes as a profitable investment was in time also applied to bishoprics and cathedrals. Although such sales were not a general phenomenon, it remains true that in some areas such as the Midi region, bishoprics were habitually sold or bequeathed as Eigenkirche. This was presumably still the practice in 1067, when the bishopric of Carcassonne was sold to the Count of Barcelona by the Viscount of Albi. Everywhere, the priest had really become essentially an estate servant. His private arrangement with the lord of the parish had in fact replaced the canonical bond uniting him to his bishop. It was this personalized local relationship that ultimately mattered, rather than the bishop's potestas jurisdictionis. Throughout Europe, to put it another way, episcopal control enjoyed by all prelates was succeeded by a division of control among an unlimited number of owners. The diocese no longer actually functioned as a single administrative unit, but as a collection of private independent churches, in which the bishop's pastoral and disciplinary powers were in practice relaxed or ignored altogether. Before long, given the moral and intellectual shortcomings of the priesthood, this diocesan centralization was to generate further serious pastoral and canonical problems. The confusion of authority and rights within the diocese just described was, in the main, also responsible for the ensuing simony and incontinence among the Western clergy. It was undoubtedly lay control of ecclesiastical structure that made possible the purchase or sale of virtually every clerical grade the general rule by the 10th century. Simony became in fact unavoidable once clerical offices began to be treated like secular appointments. If a secular vassal could be taxed on inheriting his fief, so could every clerical candidate on his elevation to office. Besides, the offices in question were profitable, and to grant them out without any remuneration would have been pointless if not unusual in the agrarian world of the Middle Ages. In the event, the bishop who had received his position by canonical election, without paying for it, had before long become a great rarity. The English monarchy. England was an exception to this rule. In the intricate web of vassalage, writes J.M. Roberts, a king might have less control over his own vassals than they over theirs. The great lord, whether lay magnate or local bishop, must always have loomed larger and more important in the life of the ordinary man than the remote and probably never seen king or prince. In the 10th and 11th centuries, there are everywhere examples of kings obviously under great pressure from great men. The country where this seemed to present least trouble was Anglo-Saxon England. England before the Viking invasions, which began in 793, was divided into 7 independent kingdoms. Each had its own bishops, but all, from the time of St. Theodore the Greek, Archbishop of Canterbury, Pansy 691, recognized the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 786, however, Prince Egfrith of the Kingdom of Wessex was anointed even before he had ascended the throne of his father, and from the time of this, the first royal anointing in Anglo-Saxon history, the Wessex dynasty gradually came to dominate political life in England. In the late 9th century, under Alfred the Great, it led the recovery against the Viking invaders, and Alfred's successors succeeded in uniting most of Britain in a single Orthodox kingdom until the Norman Papist invasion of 1066-70. In a real sense, therefore, the anointing of Egfrith may be said to have been the critical event that led to the creation of one nation and one state. King Alfred came to the throne of Wessex when English civilization was in the process of being wiped out by the pagan Danes. Almost single-handedly, he defeated the Danes and laid the foundations for their conversion and integration into his all-English kingdom. But not content with that, he undertook the organization and education of the badly shattered church, beginning by sending all his bishops a copy of his own translation of the Pastoral Care by Pope Gregory the Great. The Roman connection again. Indeed, re-establishing links with both Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church was a priority with Alfred. He corresponded with the Patriarch of Jerusalem and sent alms to the monks of India. The stability of Alfred's dynasty and kingdom by comparison with the sub-Carolingian kingdoms on the continent was partly owing to the fact that, like the Roman missionaries in the early 7th century, this Romanizing monarch found a tabula rasa and was able to rebuild on relatively uncluttered but firm foundations. In particular, the tensions between the monarchy and the local aristocracies, which so weakened the West Frankish kingdom, hardly existed in England after 878 and surfaced again in a serious way only in 1052. There are several indications that the English kingdom modelled itself on Byzantium. Thus, King Athelstan gave himself the Byzantine titles Basileus and Caragulus. Again, in 955, King Edred called himself King of the Anglo-Saxons and Emperor of the whole of Britain. And a little later, King Edgar is also called Basileus et Imperator. In the 10th century, England reached the peak of her glory as an Orthodox kingdom, based on a monastic revival supported by a powerful king, Edgar, and a holy Archbishop, Dunstan, working in close harmony. Ryan Lavelle writes, "A document from around 973, the Regularis Concordia, was intended as a rulebook and liturgical guide for English monks and nuns, but it was also a bold statement of the relationship between God, the king, and a Christian people. The king and queen were seen as protectors of monks and nuns in the temporal world, while, in return, the souls of the West Saxon royal family were protected with prayers by the same monks and nuns. The positions of the king and queen were therefore inextricably linked with the survival of Christianity in the kingdom. This was part of a process of legitimizing royal power to an extent that was hitherto unparalleled in Anglo-Saxon England. The king had become part of the ecclesiastical order in a coronation ceremony that made him God's representative on earth. The original meaning of Christ's name, Christus, meant the anointed king, and the inauguration of Edgar used an ordo, an order of service, that put Edgar on a similar level, directly anointed by God. The monastic reform movement gave this a new impetus, to such an extent that King Edgar could go through such a royal inauguration for a second time. Edgar's first anointing had taken place in 960 or 961 when he became King of England. For many years he was not allowed to wear his crown in penance for a sin he had committed. But in 973, the penance came to an end, and at the age of 30, perhaps significantly, the canonical age for episcopal ordination in the West, he was anointed again, this time as Emperor of Britain in the ancient Roman city of Bath. Again significantly, for Edgar was emphasizing the imperial Roman theme. In the same year, again emphasizing the imperial theme, he was rowed on the River Dee by 6 or 8 sub-kings, include 5 Welsh and Scottish rulers and 1 ruler of the Western Isles. This was a move, writes Lavelle, that recalled the actions of his great-uncle Athelstan, the successful ruler of Britain, but it was also an English parallel to the 10th century coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto of Germany, in which the stem dukes had undertaken the task of feeding the emperor. Edgar's ascription to himself of the trappings of Romanitas was not without some foundation. The economy was strong, the tax and legal systems were sophisticated, the coinage was secure, with an impressive system of monetary renewal, whereby all coins issued from the royal mints had to be returned and reissued every 5 years. England was now a firmly orthodox, multinational state composed of 3 Christian peoples, Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and Danes, living in mutual amity. She was at peace at home and respected abroad, spreading her influence in a beneficial way outwards through missions to the Norwegians and Swedes. Edgar married twice, the first marriage producing a son, Edward, and the second another son, Ethelred. When he died in 975, his relics were discovered to be incorrupt in 1052. Ethelred's partisans, especially his mother, argued that Ethelred should be made king in preference to his elder half-brother Edward, on the grounds that Edgar had not been anointed when he begat Edward in 959 or 960, and that his first wife, Edward's mother, had never been anointed, so that the throne should pass to the younger son, Ethelred, who had been born in the purple when both his parents were anointed sovereigns. The conflict was settled when the Archbishop of Canterbury, St. Dunstan, seized the initiative and anointed St. Edward. In this way, through her stewardship of the sacrament of royal anointing, the Church came to play the decisive role in deciding the question of succession. The religious nature of Anglo-Saxon kingship is seen in the fact that the king was seen as the warden of the Holy Temple. Crimes against the Church or her servants were seen as crimes against the king and were duly punished by him. It was seen as his duty to look after the Church and enforce her laws with secular penalties. For a Christian king is Christ's deputy among Christian people, as King Ethelred's laws put it. Both he and the archbishop were the Lord's anointed. The archbishop so that he might minister the sacraments of salvation, and the king so that, as Bede wrote in his commentary on Acts, he might by conquering all our enemies bring us to the immortal kingdom. The king was sometimes compared to God the Father and the bishop, to Christ. The bishop is often called Christ in Anglo-Saxon legislation. The king was the shepherd and father of his people, and would have to answer for their well-being at the last judgment. Regicide and usurpation were the greatest of crimes, for as Abbot Elfric wrote in a Palm Sunday sermon, "No man may make himself a king, for the people have the option to choose him for king who is agreeable to them. But after that, he has been hallowed as king, he has power over the people, and they may not shake his yoke from their necks." And so, as Archbishop Wulfstan of York wrote in his Institutes of Christian Polity, "Through what shall peace and support come to God's servants and to God's poor, save through Christ and through a Christian king?" Nor was the king's authority confined to the purely secular sphere. Thus, in England, writes Barlow, just as the king referred to his earls and thegns, so he addressed his archbishops, bishops, and abbots. The prelates were his men, his servants. Their churches and estates were in his gift and under his protection and control. He could even grant the rank of bishops without the office or benefice. It was he who decided under what rule his monasteries should live, what saints should be recognized, what festivals observed. And yet the relationship between church and state in England was one of symphony in the Byzantine sense, not of Caesaropapism, for the kings, as well as being in general exceptionally pious, did nothing without consulting their bishops and other members of the witan or assembly, who were not afraid to disagree with the king or remind him of his obligations. Thus, continues Barlow, a true theocratic government was created, yet one, despite the common charge of confusion between spiritual and political functions against the Anglo-Saxon Church, remarkably free of confusion in theory. The duality of the two spheres was emphatically proclaimed. There were God's rights and the king's rights, Christ's laws and the laws of the world. There was an independent ecclesiastical jurisdiction under the control of the bishop, but there was also the helping hand of the secular power which the Church had invoked and which it could use at its discretion. Rome and the Holy Roman Empire. Turning to Rome now. The first half of the 10th century was probably the period of the deepest degradation in the Eternal City's pre-schism history. The so-called pornocracy of Marozia, an evil woman who with her mother Theodora unmade, lived with and begat a series of popes. However, in 932, Marozia's second son Alberic, Marquis of Spoleto, imprisoned his mother, took over the government of Rome, and gave it a short period of peace and relative respectability. But in 955, Alberic died, and his son Octavian became Pope John V at the age of 16. Even for a pope of that period, writes de Rosa, he was so bad that the citizens were out for his blood. He had invented sins, they said, not known since the beginning of the world, including sleeping with his mother. He ran a harem in the Lateran Palace. He gambled with pilgrims' offerings. He kept a stud of 2,000 horses which he fed on almonds and figs steeped in wine. He rewarded the companions of his knights of love with golden chalices from St. Peter's. He did nothing for the most profitable tourist trade of the day, namely, pilgrimages. Women in particular were warned not to enter St. John Lateran if they prized their honour. The Pope was always on the prowl. In front of the high altar of the Mother Church of Christendom, he even toasted the devil. Retribution was coming, however. Berengar, king of Lombardy in northern Italy, advanced on Rome, and the Pope in desperation appealed to Berengar's feudal lord, Otto of Germany. This was Otto's opportunity to seize that imperial crown, which would give him complete dominance over his rivals. He marched into Italy, drove out Berengar, and was crowned emperor by John on February 2, 962. However, when Otto demanded that the inhabitants of the Papal States should swear an oath of allegiance to him, Otto, and not to the Pope, thereby treating the Papal States as one of his dependencies, the Pope took fright, transferred his support to Berengar, and called on both the Hungarians and the Byzantines to help drive Otto out of Italy. But Otto saw this as treachery on the part of the Pope. He summoned a synod in Rome, deposed John, and placed Leo VIII in his place. Then he inserted a clause into his agreement with Leo, whereby, in future, no pope was to be consecrated without taking an oath of loyalty to the emperor. Although Otto was crowned in Rome, he did not call himself Emperor of the Romans, but preferred simply Emperor. This was probably because he did not wish to enter into a competition with the Byzantine emperor. It may also have been because he had little admiration for old Rome, nor did they admire him. Indeed, it is from this time that the struggle between the Franco-German and Greco-Roman parties for control of the papacy began, a struggle which ended in the middle of the 11th century with the final victory of the Franco-German party and the fall of orthodoxy. Thus, Cyriac Lamprilos writes, "The people of Rome preferred to govern themselves under a republican form of government, with a consul as their supreme magistrate, under the nominal protectorate of the Greco-Roman emperors of Constantinople, rather than support the temporal domination of their bishops, who had often been imposed on them by the Teutonic emperors and kept there by force." For one should note that in general, before the pontificate of Gregory VII, the party of the popes in Rome was usually the same as the imperialist party, with the emperors of the West of barbaric origin, and that, by contrast, the popular party sympathized with the Greco-Roman Empire of the East. Those of the popes who were supported by the Teutons also laid claim to temporal power, either as receivers or as vicars of the emperors of the West, while the others restricted themselves to spiritual power alone. Voltaire, in his essay on History and Customs, chapter 36, made the observation that the imprudence of Pope John V in having called the Germans to Rome was the source of all the calamities to which Rome and Italy were subject down the centuries. Be that as it may, Otto seems to have impressed the Byzantines sufficiently to obtain their recognition of his imperial title, which, as we have seen, did not contain the word Roman, and to persuade them to send Princess Theophano to be the bride of his son, Otto II. The marriage was celebrated in Rome in 972. Theophano then introduced another Byzantine, John Philogathos, as godfather of her son, Otto III. He later became head of the royal finances and finally, Pope, or anti-pope, John II. This led to a sharp increase in Byzantine influence in the Western Empire and the temporary eclipse of the new papist theory of church-state relations. Thus, in an ivory bas-relief, Christ is shown crowning Otto II and Theophano, an authentically Byzantine 10th century motif. The image, as Jean-Paul Allard writes, was more eloquent than any theological treatise. It illustrated a principle that the papacy and the Roman Church have never accepted, but which was taken for granted in Byzantium and is still held in orthodoxy today. Christ and Christ alone crowns the sovereigns. Power comes only from God, without the intercession of an institutional representative of the Church, be he patriarch or pope. The anointing and crowning of the sovereign do not create the legitimacy of his power, but have as their sole aim the manifestation of this legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Sole aim is an exaggeration. Anointing and crowning also sanctify the king, giving him the divine grace without which he cannot fulfill his duties in a manner pleasing to God. Moreover, there is a difference in legitimacy between the God-chosen Orthodox sovereign and any other ruler, a difference that is expressed by the Latin terms legalis and legitimus. Nevertheless, the main point stands. Legitimate political power comes directly from God. In 991, Princess Theophano died, and the young Otto III became emperor under the regency of his grandmother Adelaide. He dreamed of reuniting the two empires of East and West into one day, so as to restore universal peace, a new imperial peace comparable to that of Augustus, a Roman Empire which would embrace once more the orbis terrarum before the end of the world that was announced for the year 1000. To signify that the Renovatio Imperii Romani, originally a Carolingian idea, had truly begun, he moved his court from Aachen to Rome and began negotiations with the Byzantine emperor for the hand of a daughter or niece of the Basilius that would enable him to unite the two empires in a peaceful, matrimonial way. And, imitating the Byzantine concept of a family of kings under the emperor, he handed out crowns to King Stephen of Hungary and the Polish Duke Boleslav. The plan for union with Byzantium was foiled, but Byzantine influence continued to increase. The new pope, breaking sharply with recent tradition, emphasized that while the Renovatio embraced empire and church, it had to be led by the emperor. Again, it was Sylvester who, in 1001, inspired Otto to issue an act demonstrating that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. Another striking characteristic of this very unpapist pope was his declaration that there could be no question of the pope being above the judgment of his fellow bishops. Thus he wrote in 997, "The judgment of God is higher than that of Rome." When Pope Marcellinus offered incense to Jupiter in 303, did all the other bishops have to do likewise? If the Bishop of Rome himself sins against his brother or refuses to heed the repeated warnings of the Church, he, the Bishop of Rome himself, must, according to the commandments of God, be treated as a pagan and a publican. For the greater the dignity, the greater the fall. If he declares us unworthy of his communion, because none of us will join him against the gospel, he will not be able to separate us from the communion of Christ. Thus, by the year 1000, there was little trace of papism in the West. It was the Byzantine ideal of symphonic church-state relations that had triumphed in the West's most powerful monarchies. However, Otto III died in 1002 and Pope Sylvester in 1003, after which the symphony between church and state at the highest level of Western society began to break up. Like a spinning top that, as it begins to slow down, at the same time begins to lurch more and more sharply from one side to the other, so the balance of power shifted first to the emperor and then to the pope. In the first half of the 11th century, it was the German emperors who held the upper hand as the papacy descended into one of its periodic bouts of decadence. Suddenly, as Papadakis puts it, the papacy was turned into a sort of imperial Eigenkirche, or vicarage of the German crown. The pope was to be the instrument and even the pawn of the Germans, as opposed to the Romans. At the same time, the heresy of the Filioque reared its head again. In 1009, Pope Sergius IV reintroduced it into the Roman symbol of faith, upon which the great church of Constantinople promptly removed his name from the diptychs. In 1014, the heretical innovation was recited again at the coronation of Emperor Henry II. Some date the beginning of the Great Schism to this period, although it was another 40 years before the formal lack of communion between East and West was cemented by the anathemas of 1054. In 1046, Emperor Henry III acted decisively to stop the chaos into which the Roman papacy had descended, as rival families of Roman aristocrats, the Crescenti and Tusculum counts, each tried to place their candidate on the throne of St. Peter. At the Council of Sutri, Henry forced the resignation of Pope Gregory VI and the deposition of Popes Sylvester III and Benedict IX. Then he proceeded to nominate 4 German popes in succession: Clement II, Damasus II, Leo IX, and Victor II. However, in 1056, Henry died while his son was still a child. and it was at this point that German Caesaropapism began to fall. It was struck down by one of the greatest spiritual despots in history, Pope Gregory VI, better known as Hildebrand, the papal reform movement. One of the Emperor Henry's appointees, Pope Leo IX, had been Bishop of Toul in Lorraine, an area that had come under the influence of a network of monasteries under the leadership of the great Burgundian Abbey of Cluny, founded by Duke William the Pious of Aquitaine in 910. The Cluniac monasteries were not Eigenkirchen, but Stavropegial foundations independent of the control of any feudal lord. As such, they had assumed the leadership of a powerful reform movement directed against the corruptions introduced into the church by the feudal system, and had had considerable success in this respect. They stressed papal authority, clerical celibacy, and ecclesiastical centralization. Leo IX now introduced the principles of the Cluniac movement into the government of the Church at the highest level, but with results, in the reign of his successor, Gregory VII, Hildebrand, that went far beyond the original purposes of the movement, and which were finally to tear the whole of the West away from New Rome and the Byzantine Commonwealth of Nations. From the outset, writes Papadakis, the new pope was determined to make the papacy an instrument of spiritual and moral rejuvenation both in Rome itself and throughout Europe. To this end, Pope Leo journeyed to central and south Italy, but also to France and Germany, crossing the Alps 3 times. Nearly 4.5 years of his 5-year pontificate were in fact spent on trips outside Rome. The numerous regional reforming synods held during these lengthy sojourns often had as their target the traffic in ecclesiastical offices and unchaste clergy. Their object above all was to rid the Church of these abused by restoring canonical discipline. The need to reassert both the validity and binding power of canon law for all clergy was repeatedly emphasized. In addition to the decrees against simony and sexual laxity promulgated by these local synods, however, simoniacal and concubinary clergy were examined and, when required, suspended, deposed, and even excommunicated. The object, in short, was to punish the offenders as well. Even if the synods were not always successful, no one was in doubt that Leo IX and his team of like-minded assistants were serious. The immediate impact of this flurry of activity was often extraordinary. Overall, the progress of the new papal program was not all smooth sailing. Widespread protest, often accompanied by violent protest, was to continue for decades. Yet, all in all, by the end of the century, the popular defenders of simony, of clerical marriage, and of the evils of the proprietary church had by and large vanished. The champions of reform, at any rate, proved more unyielding than their often more numerous adversaries. This was particularly evident in the skillful drive of the reformers to make celibacy an absolute prerequisite to ordination. This part of the Gregorian platform was reinforced by the monastic ideal, since many of the reformers were actually monks and had already embraced a continent life. Some, like the ascetic Peter Damian, Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, were even eager to treat the problem as heresy and not as a matter of discipline. But the reformers were perhaps also uncompromising on this issue, because they were convinced that compulsory clerical continence could advance the process of delaicization. Another, more general item of their platform, a monasticized priesthood, quite simply, was viewed by reformers everywhere as a crucial corrective to clerical involvement in the world. If successful, the strategy, it was hoped, would provide the clergy with that sense of solidarity and corporate identity needed to distinguish them from the laity. In all essential respects, as one scholar has put it, the reforming initiatives of the popes were an attempt by men trained in the monastic discipline to remodel church and society according to monastic ideals, to train churchmen to rethink themselves as a distinct order with a lifestyle totally different from that of laymen. Behind the campaign for celibacy, in sum, aside from the moral and canonical issues involved, was the desire to set all churchmen apart from and above the laity, the need to create a spiritual elite by the separation of the priest from the ordinary layman was an urgent priority. Doubtless, in the end, the Gregorian priesthood did achieve a certain libertas and even a sense of community, but only at the expense of a sharp opposition between itself and the rest of society. By contrast, in the Christian East, as in primitive Christianity, a wholly celibate priesthood never became the norm. It often happens in history that one important historical process going in one direction masks the presence of another going in precisely the opposite direction. We see the same contradiction in this, the final chapter of Western Orthodox history. The process of ecclesiastical reformation initiated by Pope Leo IX in 1049, which aimed at the liberation of the Church from secular control, was, generally speaking, and with the exception of the element of clerical celibacy, a laudable and necessary program. But the increasing distance it placed between the clergy and the laity was fraught with danger. In particular, it threatened to undermine the traditional place in Christian society of the anointed kings, who occupied a kind of intermediate position between the clergy and the laity. And in the hands of two ambitious clerics who entered the service of the papacy at about this time, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida and Archdeacon Hildebrand, the future Pope Gregory VII, it threatened simply to replace the Caesaropapist variety of feudalism with a Papocaeserist variety, that is, the subjection of the clergy to lay lords with the subjection of the laity and even the kings to clerical lords, or rather, to just one clerical lord, the Pope. The problem was that by the middle of the 11th century, church and state were so deeply entangled with each other that nobody, on either side of the controversy, could conceive of a return to the traditional system of the symphony of powers, which allowed for the relative independence of both powers within a single Christian society. Thus, the Church wished to be liberated from lay investiture, but she did not want to be deprived of the lands, vassals, and, therefore, political power, which came with investiture. Indeed, the last act in the life of Pope Leo IX himself was his marching into battle at the head of a papal army in 1053 in order to secure his feudal domains in Benevento, which had been granted to him by his kinsman, Emperor Henry III. Contemporary Western society was shocked by that, for worldly and entangled in secular affairs as bishops had become, it was still felt that war was not an activity suited to a churchman. But that shock was as nothing to the trauma caused in the 1070s and 1080s by Hildebrand's creative interpretation of the basic feudal relationship. All Christians, he said, were the soldiers of Christ and the vassals of St. Peter, i.e., of the Pope, and the Pope had the right to call on all the laity to break their feudal oaths and take up arms against their lords, in obedience to himself, their ultimate feudal suzerain, who would repay them not with lands or physical security, but with the absolution of sins and everlasting life. Thus freedom from lay control, on the one hand, but control over the laity, and greater secular power, on the other. That was the program, both contradictory and hypocritical, of the reformed papacy. But before undertaking this assault on the West, the papacy needed to secure its rear in the East. This was achieved by picking a quarrel with the Eastern Church and sending Cardinal Humbert to Constantinople to anathematize it in 1054. Pope Leo IX was actually dead when the exchange of anathemas took place, but that he was a truly papist pope is proved by his words. If anywhere in the universe any people proudly disagrees with the Roman Church, it can no longer be called or considered to be a church. It is already an assemblage of heretics, a conventicle of schismatics, a synagogue of Satan. In reply to this, Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople said, "O you who are orthodox, flee the fellowship of those who have accepted the heretical Latins and who regard them as the first Christians in the Catholic and Holy Church of God. For it was in this proud exaltation of the opinion of one local church, the Roman, or rather of one man in one local church, above the universal church, that the whole tragedy of the further development of Western civilization lay. The now definitely secular character of the papacy was demonstrated at the inauguration of Pope Nicholas II, at whose inauguration a quasi-royal coronation was introduced as part of the rite. Then, in 1059, he decreed that the popes should be elected by the cardinal bishops alone, without the participation of the people. The role of the Roman clergy and people, writes Canning, was reduced to one of mere assent to the choice. The historical participation of the emperor was bypassed with the formula, saving the honour and reverence due to our beloved son Henry IV, who is for the present regarded as king, and who, it is hoped, is going to be emperor with God's grace, inasmuch as we have now conceded this to him and to his successors, who shall personally obtain this right from the Apostolic See. 60 years before, Otto III had bombastically claimed that he had ordained and created the Pope. Now the wheel had come round full circle. The emperors were emperors only by virtue of receiving this right from the Pope. The rise of the Normans. 4 months later, the new Pope made a hardly less momentous decision. He entered into alliance at Melfi with the Normans of South Italy, the same nation whom the last Orthodox Pope, Leo IX, had died fighting, and whom he had cursed on his deathbed. The alliance was momentous because up to this moment the popes had always turned for protection to the Christian Roman Emperor, whether of East Rome or of the Holy Roman Empire of the West. Indeed, the Pope had insisted on crowning the Holy Roman Emperor precisely because he was the papacy's official guardian, for it was unheard of that the Church of Rome should recognize as her official guardian any other power than the Roman Emperor, from whom, according to the forged donation of Constantine, she had herself received her quasi-imperial dignity and power. But just as, in the middle of the 8th century, the papacy had rejected the Byzantines in favor of the Franks, so now, after cutting the last remaining links with Byzantium by anathematizing the Orthodox Church, it rejected the Germans in favor of the Normans, a recently formed nation of Viking origin but French speech and culture. Now the Normans had recently seized a large swathe of land belonging to the Lombards and Byzantines in southern Italy. The Pope legitimized this robbery in exchange for the Norman leaders Richard of Capua and Robert Guiscard becoming his feudal vassals and swearing to support the papacy. In addition, Robert Guiscard specifically promised, "If you or your successors die before me, I will help to enforce the dominant wishes of the cardinals and of the Roman clergy and laity in order that a pope may be chosen and established to the honor of St. Peter." Guiscard was as good as his word. Every stage in the Norman progress entailed from the first a practical extension of papal power in the countries which were being subjected to the Normans. Thus, after 1059, the Norman conquests were made progressively to subserve the restoration of the Latin Rite and the extension of papal jurisdiction in southern Italy, at the expense both of the Byzantines and of the German Emperor, Henry IV, who was at that time still a child and therefore unable to react to the assault on his position. Even before this, the papacy had begun to forge close bonds with the Normans in their homeland in northern France, whence the papal assault on that other fortress of old-style Orthodox autocracy, England, would soon be launched. Thus, in 1055, the year after Duke William of Normandy seized effective control of his duchy by defeating a coalition led by his lord, King Henry I of France, the old-fashioned, that is, Orthodox, Archbishop Mauga was deposed to make way for the more forward-looking Maurilius. He introduced a new and extraneous element, that is, an element more in keeping with the ideals of the heretical Reformed papacy, into the Norman Church. Then, in 1059, papal sanction for the marriage between Duke William and Matilda of Flanders, which had been withheld by Leo IX, was finally obtained, opening the way for full cooperation between the Normans and the Pope. Finally, William supported the candidacy of Alexander II to the throne as against that of Honorius II, who was supported by the German Empress Agnes. The Pope now owed a debt of gratitude to the Normans, which they were soon to call in. By the 1060s, then, there were only two powers in the West that stood in the way of the complete triumph of the crude, militaristic ethos of feudalism: the orthodox autocracies of England and Germany. By the end of the century, both powers had been brought low, England by military conquest and its transformation into a single feudal fief at the hands of the Normans, and Germany by cunning dialectic and the fear of excommunication by the Pope. The challenge facing the English. The weakness of the English consisted in the fact that in their whole history there was not a single instance of struggle with Rome over doctrinal, as opposed to canonical or administrative matters, nor any appeal by the English Church to the Eastern churches against the Pope, so that there were no clear indications as to how a struggle between the King and the Pope, or the local church and the Pope, would end. However, from the late 10th century, instances of tension between England and Rome become more common. Thus, St. Dunstan refused to sanction an uncanonical marriage which the Pope approved of, saying, "I am not to be moved, even by the threat of death, from the authority of my Lord." Again, in 991, at a council in Reims attended by English as well as French bishops, Arnulf, Bishop of Orleans, said that if Pope John XV had no love and was puffed up with knowledge, he was the Antichrist. And in the early 11th century, Archbishop Wulfstan of York openly warned the Pope against the sin of simony, while King Canute obtained from him a promise not to exact money from the English archbishops for the pallium. But these were minor challenges compared with the one that now faced the English. For now, if they were to preserve their spiritual and national identity, they would have to break, finally and decisively, with the place and the institution to which they had been so devoted: Rome and the Roman papacy.